Hey guys, welcome back and thanks for joining me. I'm your host Sherry and you are joining me on the dark side. I was browsing on HBO Max the other night and I saw there was a new documentary called They Called Him Mostly Harmless. I immediately recognized the name and that this was the hiker from 2018. He went by the name Mostly Harmless, and I remembered him because internet users were trying to figure out exactly who he was. This case is seriously mysterious. As always, my sources are listed in the description area. This is episode 105, The Case of Mostly Harmless. On July 23rd, 2018, Nicholas Horton and his friend Logan Bueller were looking for a place to rest. They are day hikers and had hiked 10 miles through Big Cypress National Preserve in Collier County, Florida. It's 8 o'clock p.m. and they want to sit down and rest, but kept going even though they're tired and irritable and their car was still 6 miles away. They see a sign ahead and felt some relief because the sign said that 100 yards ahead was a campsite and water. They were glad to get some rest. The temperatures were in the 90s that day, and even at 8 p.m., it's still 85 and humid. This is swamp territory. They get to the camping area and see someone has set up their tent. This is a very primitive area, and it's the only tent around for miles. The tent is bright yellow, and there's hiking boots sitting outside of it, along with hiking poles. Those are staffs that hikers use to walk with on each hand. They protect your knees and help with balance. There is also a picnic table sitting near the tent. The tent was small. It was just enough to lay down in. You may be able to sit in it, but you certainly couldn't stand up. You'd be able to crawl in and crawl out, and it was big enough for a sleeping bag and a backpack. They don't want to bother the camper. He could be taking a nap, but they want to sit down at this picnic table that's right next to the tent, and they're desperate here. Logan calls out to the camper in his tent. "Hey man, we're going to sit at your picnic table. We're just taking a few minutes and then we'll be gone." The person inside the tent doesn't acknowledge them. They figure maybe he's sleeping, but it's so quiet that any noise would certainly wake him up. They sit at the table and ate granola bars and shared some water. They're wondering about this guy in the tent. His hiking boots are sitting next to the tent, so he's probably not out walking somewhere, but there's no movement coming from inside the tent. Nicholas goes to look for more water, and Logan peers through the small mesh window of the tent. He yells for Nicholas to come back. Nick comes jogging back over, and Logan tells him, "I don't think that guy's doing too good. His eyes are open, but he's just sitting there, staring straight ahead." Nicholas takes a look and says he thinks he's dead. They move away from the tent, and Nicholas calls 911. He tells the operator, "We just found a dead body." The men are trying to give their location, but they're in a national preserve and it's pretty hard to pinpoint an exact location out there. According to the sheriff's report, they were found at Noble's campsite, which is 5 miles north of Interstate 75's mile marker 63. They're roughly 100 miles west of Miami. Nicholas told Naples Daily News that it was incredibly freaky. He said all the pain he had been feeling in his feet from hiking all day suddenly disappeared from the adrenaline he was feeling. The man inside the tent was in fact deceased, and at first it's unknown how long he had been there. Paramedics arrive and look in the tent, and they see a man sitting up staring straight ahead. They enter the very small tent and get him out. They note he is incredibly skinny. At first, police figured this would be easy. Just look in the guy's wallet and check his ID, or find out who's missing a hiker. But this would be anything but easy. What should have been 2 or 3 days to solve this case became a 2-year-long mystery. It was a search for the man's identity. They take him to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. The man is 5 foot 8 inches tall, and he weighs 83 pounds. Yes, 83 pounds. The medical examiner noted that he hadn't been dead for very long. I don't know if that means 10 minutes or 2 days. He had a beard, which made him look older, but he had a young-looking face. They estimated him to be mid-30s, but he could be as old as 50. He had a scar on his abdomen, one that had been there for a long time. It was a surgical linear line, so we know he possibly had surgery years ago on his abdomen. There were no drugs in his system or in his tent, nor were there any indications that he was a drug user or a heavy drinker. In his stomach, they found no food, but he had ibuprofen and an antihistamine. Although he did have a bowel movement inside, so we know he had eaten something recently. Police and the medical examiner found no signs of foul play. He wasn't bitten by a snake. He didn't have cancer. He didn't have an infection. He wasn't injured. The medical examiner did note cachexia, and I hope that I'm pronouncing that right. I had to look this up. The short version is mass muscle loss, usually associated with anorexia, cancer, or HIV. Our unknown hiker's official cause of death was ruled as undetermined. They believed he died of natural causes. He had no tattoos, his fingerprints didn't match up with anyone in the national database, nor did his dental records. His teeth were noted as in excellent condition, and there wasn't any evidence that he had previous dental work. Investigators are unable to connect him to any missing persons reports. They also couldn't match him to anyone in the facial recognition database. In his tent, they found no ID, no credit cards, or anything that would help them figure out who he was. He didn't even have a cell phone. They found food, plenty of it. They found $3,640 in cash. This amount of money suggests that he was living out there, not just a day hiker. They found his backpack, which was super big and heavy. He had good high-end gear. Investigators thought they hit pay dirt when they found a notebook. Hopefully it contains some good information. Instead, they open it and find recipes for protein bars, which isn't helpful at all to them. But then they find some kind of cryptic code. It's numbers and letters everywhere with circles around some of them. I looked at one of the pages and it must have contained 500 three-digit numbers on one page. Like, whoever this guy is, he's obviously good at something, like a really smart guy. I find it boggling. He likely starved to death, but he had food on him that he didn't eat. It was just 5 miles from the highway. He had resources. If it got so bad, he could have checked into a hotel. He had thousands of dollars on him. None of this makes sense. Police draw a composite sketch of what this man's face looks like, and they release it to the public. The artist's rendering is a man from the shoulders up with a surprised look on his face. He has a beard, and the face is sunken in and skinny. As the days pass on, no one has come forward claiming they were missing a loved one who was last known to be hiking in Florida. Detective David Herm of the Collier County Sheriff's Office said, "The medical examiner is responsible for his care and custody until we have a family member to turn him over to for final arrangements." According to NWF Daily News, a woman named Kelly Fairbanks came forward claiming she recognized the composite sketch. She said she met the man 6 months before he was found deceased. She instantly knew it was him. The only problem is that she doesn't know his real name. She only knew him by his trail name, which is mostly Harmless. I had to look up what a trail name was. A trail name is something that is bestowed upon you by another hiker most times. It can be just one word or it can be 3 to 4 words. Folks who hike the Appalachian Trail will meet other hikers all the time. A lot of times they don't want to give out their true identity, so they are given a trail name and it just kind of sticks with them. For example, if I'm hiking the Appalachian Trail, my trail name would likely be the Dark Side. I'm kidding, by the way. But from what I've gathered from the hiking forums I've browsed through, it's a trail name needs to be given to you by someone else. You cannot make up your own. You must accept a trail name for it to become your trail name. You are allowed to change your trail name. And you can get a new trail name on a new hike, which is what we know our hiker did. He started out with the trail name Denim, and then eventually it was changed to mostly Harmless. Our mystery hiker was given the trail name Denim when he first started out on the Appalachian Trail. Yes, we learned he was on the Appalachian Trail for a while, but I'll get into that later. Folks he ran into on the hike called him Denim because he was wearing jeans, which is a big rookie mistake. Apparently, it's a really bad idea to wear jeans while hiking. I guess you want to wear cargo pants or something like that. But our hiker started out wearing jeans, and people thought it was funny enough to give him the trail name Denim. So when he ran into people, he referred to himself as Denim. He never gave anyone his real name. His trail name would eventually be changed to Mostly Harmless. Kelly Fairbanks is what you call a trail angel. A trail angel is usually a local person who lives near the trail. They spot you hiking and come over and ask you if you need anything. Some trail angels are kind enough to even wash your clothes for you. They give you water, Gatorade, granola bars, and fresh fruit. I listened to a story about Mostly Harmless told by a hiker, and she noted that when someone gives you fresh fruit on a long hike, it's like manna from heaven. Fruit is so heavy to carry with you in your pack, so for someone to bring you an orange is wonderful. Kelly spotted Mostly Harmless hiking one day in January 2018. This is 6 months before he died. She said he had a big smile and they had a long conversation. She said he was very handsome and had beautiful eyes. She gave him some things to drink and asked if he needed any help or assistance. He pulled out a large paper map of Florida. She told him it may be beneficial to download the Florida Trail Guide app. A lot of hikers in the area use it and it's a good resource. But he said he didn't own a cell phone. She thought it was strange because he had no GPS or even a compass. He didn't have other hikers with him. He was literally just winging it. He told her he started hiking in New York and his plan was to finish in the Florida Keys. Kelly said she thought he was okay because he had made it this far. Obviously, he knows what he's doing. She offered to let him come to her home and take a shower and wash his clothes, but he declined. Mostly, Kelly remembers his warm personality and his charm. Just a very friendly guy who didn't ask for anything. Many people came forward after this, claiming they know this guy. A thing I've learned about hikers is that they love to take pictures of other hikers they meet. There are dozens of photos of our hiker taken by others in the year and a half he spent hiking before he was found deceased. All the photos showed a smiling, handsome man who was average build. He was not super emancipated, which is how we know he will eventually become. What the heck happened? Everyone said he was very kind and friendly. Why isn't anyone looking for him? He must have people who care for him, a brother, a sister, an ex-wife, possibly a child out there who is missing their dad. Who are you? We learn he only gave his trail name and little bits and pieces of his background. We think he was telling the truth in some of these, such as he told one woman he was from Louisiana. He told someone else he was from New York. I promise it will all make sense in the end. He told someone he worked in the IT field as a computer programmer. StrangeOutdoors.com put together a really good timeline on their website of our hiker, and I'll read you the shorthand version to you so you can understand his background for the last year and a half before he was found deceased. They created this timeline using the stories from people he met along the way. He told people he started hiking in New York in April of 2017. His name in the beginning was Denim, and then it changed to Mostly Harmless. 6 months later, which is October 2017, he was in Damascus, Virginia. He had ventured off the trail and went out for pizza with several other hikers. We have what I believe to be photos of the group that night at the pizza shop, and Mostly Harmless looks like he is enjoying himself some pizza, and he is smiling and they look like an old group of friends. He was staying at a hostel for a few days since there was a hurricane coming to the area. The next month, November 2017, it's the same week as Thanksgiving. Mostly Harmless checks into another hostel in Hiawassee, Georgia. This hostel wouldn't allow people to sign in under their trail name. They had to give their actual name, so he signs Bill Bellamy. Then we learned that this was not his real name. It was just a name he used in the guest book as an alias. He stayed for one night, and then he checked out since the hostel was closed for Thanksgiving. He came back a day later and stayed 2 nights before purchasing a yellow tent and heading back on the trail. This was the same tent he was found in. December 2017, we know he was in Blairsville, Georgia because his photo was taken by a hiker at Mountain Crossing. And 2 days later, he was in Blue Ridge, Georgia. A hiker who was a young guy met him. I saw an interview with this guy in the documentary, and I really liked him and his guitar playing and his singing. He says Mostly Harmless introduced himself as Denim, and these two hit it off and hung out for a bit. He says he and Denham talked for hours into the night over a fire, and the conversation got pretty deep. He wouldn't tell this other guy his name, but talked a little bit about his background. This is the first time anything will really be known about his history. He said Denham told him his dad was abusive to him and he didn't want to talk about his parents. He did briefly mention that he had a sister. He also said he had an ex-girlfriend. The conversation then became more lighthearted and they discussed sci-fi TV shows and movies. Specifically, they both liked Doctor Who. They parted ways eventually. This other guy asked Denham if he wants to keep in touch, and Denham said no. They shook hands, wished each other the best, and each went their own way. Some believe that Mostly Harmless's interest in science fiction may have led him to the name Mostly Harmless, since that was the title of the final book in Douglas Adams' series, A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Others say it came from him being introduced to some other hikers, and one of them joked, "Don't worry, he's mostly harmless." December 29th, 2017, a hiker took a photo of Mostly Harmless near the Alabama-Georgia line. By February 2018, we know he's finally reached Florida because he ran into people there. He told one woman at a campground that he had been staying with his sister in Sarasota, Florida. We will learn that this was a lie. We're not sure why he told her that. He also told her he worked in the tech field. Each person who crossed paths with Mostly Harmless all agreed he was kind, he asked for nothing, and he was a good conversationalist. A woman whose trail's name is Obsidian spent the most time with him. They actually hiked 100 miles together and parted ways in Virginia after giving each other a fist bump, and she says he walked off into the rain. Obsidian says you meet a lot of good people while hiking the Appalachian Trail, and Mostly Harmless was one of them. One thing was the same with everyone who met him. They all said his backpack was enormously large, like almost cartoonish. It weighed 50 pounds. He seemed like he wasn't an experienced hiker, but he managed to hike for a year and a half, which is a respectable feat, and he was learning as he went. Most believed he was no more than 30 years old. 3 months before his death, this is April 2018, he met an older man whose trail name is Waterboy. They hung out for a bit. Waterboy got some pictures of Mostly Harmless. These would be the last known photos of him. It showed him with his beard cut much shorter. He appeared maybe slightly skinnier than previous photos, but nowhere near 83 pounds. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's the photos that Waterboy took are the bottom left-hand corner and the top right corner. People noticed he was much tanner. He also didn't have that big smile he had in all of his photos. Waterboy asked him why he was carrying that giant backpack. How the hell are you doing it? Mostly Harmless tells him that he still had all of his winter clothes in there. Waterboy offers to take the clothes from him and says he will mail them to him at a later date, but Mostly Harmless declines. He said he asked for nothing, but when Waterboy offered him water and Gatorades, he accepted. I just realized right this very second that that's likely where he got the name Waterboy from. He's probably known to give out water to other hikers. Since Waterboy is the only known person to have interacted with Mostly Harmless at the end, people had questions for him. When asked how much he appeared to weigh, Waterboy estimated that he was around 150 pounds. Just 3 months and 9 days later, Mostly Harmless would be found dead and weighing only 83 pounds. The craziest part to me is that where he was found was only 10 miles from his interaction with Waterboy. Is it possible he made his way to the Florida Keys and was heading north again when he pitched his tent at the Cypress National Preserve? No one knows what he was doing during those 3 months. He may have parted ways with Waterboy and went 10 miles further to the Cypress National Preserve and stayed there for the last 3 months. Detectives are combing through the thousands of tips they are receiving. Something that made me laugh when I watched the documentary was one person who said that some of the theories were extremely outlandish, such as a photo that someone took of Mostly Harmless. He was looking at a sign and standing really close to it. So they suggested that he had extremely poor vision and couldn't see the food in his backpack. I'm not saying this person's theory is 100% impossible, but it seems like a long reach. These are the kind of tips that get called in and they have to filter through. The best tips were the ones that included photos of Mostly Harmless on the trail. These are known interactions with him. In this day and age, it seems almost impossible to be completely incognito, but Mostly Harmless managed to do it somehow. He hiked 1,400 miles. He met so many people, and no one knew his real name. Hikers all say he did not appear mentally ill or even mentally unwell. He seemed to have a purpose for what he was doing. The true crime side of me looked for other things, like maybe this was a hostage situation, but I don't think there's any foul play involved. But what bothered me is, why is no one coming forward? The Collier County Sheriff's Department even released a podcast in hopes that it would draw attention to the case. His notebooks filled with coding were a clue. We know this guy may be a genius. A coder read through the notebook and said this was very good info. This shows the mind of a brilliant person. He wasn't just a madman scribbling down numbers. These codes actually made sense. We learned that the codes come from an online game called Screeps. It's a game for computer programmers. In the game, you control your colony by writing JavaScript. People go to this game and look for players who were active but stopped in April 2017, which would have been the time that Mostly Harmless started hiking. They did find a user by the name of Vahor that many believe was Mostly Harmless. The reason for this is he told another player in the chat log while discussing the game, "I'm mostly harmless for now." Then he stopped playing in April 2017. They looked at the chat logs and he seemed like a decent person. He didn't say much to other players other than just game talk, and that he loved the game and he would often play until 4 a.m. Another user told him that he was sick and he had lost his voice, and Vahor responded, "No one would notice if I lost my voice." Mostly Harmless's story was in a lot of missing in Florida Facebook groups, but it wasn't super popular. Until one day, a man by the name of Nicholas Thompson for the news outlet Wired ran a long story about him. You'll find that this story he wrote was a huge source in helping me tell you this story. Nicholas figured that since Mostly Harmless has ties to the technology industry, maybe if he ran his story, people would see it and maybe remember him. As a side note, Wired is a very popular publication in the tech community. This article was brilliant and it really took off. This is where I first heard of Mostly Harmless. Nicholas is hoping that one of his tech friends will see it and say, "Oh yeah, that's Jim. He left to go hike the Appalachian Trail and no one's seen him since." The article ended up getting almost 2 million views. Suddenly, true crime Facebook groups were growing, and the talks of Mostly Harmless were becoming an obsession for many people. People became online detectives trying to figure out who this guy is and give him his name back. People are captivated. Everyone had their own romanticized version of him. Is he a man who abandoned all modern technology and just decided to take off one day? Did he have a wife and children? What's up with the long scar on his abdomen? He has to have an elaborate backstory. Many saw him as a superhero who just wanted to find peace in the wilderness. We know he likely wasn't an experienced hiker when he left. He had all the signs of being new to this, such as hiking in denim jeans and carrying this comically large backpack so many commented on. What was he trying to escape from? Nicholas Thompson from Wired magazine, the author of this now viral article about Mostly Harmless, said that he was flooded with tips along with the Collier County Police in Florida. He said he's heard everything. There were people who, stay with me now, believe that he may have been an extraterrestrial who was hiking the Appalachian Trail to see what life on Earth was all about. Once completed, he ventured into his tent to waste away and leave his earthly body. But Nicholas says one really convincing one was a woman who said this man's name is Daryl Mackenzie. She said Daryl had terminal cancer and he wanted to hike to his death. He said, "I want to come into this world without a name and I plan on leaving the same way." Nicholas mentions this to his editor and they both get to work trying to locate details about a guy named Daryl Mackenzie. He found a Facebook user and they only had a few photos and they were all wilderness photos. He only had 4 Facebook friends. So Nicholas messages one of them and asks about Daryl. He explained who he was and why he was asking her. She called him and began crying right away, thinking her friend had passed away. She called him back a couple minutes later and said, "That's not Daryl." She sent him photos of the real Daryl, who was a hiker and currently living in Los Angeles. This made Nicholas feel awful, he says, because he wanted to solve this case and figure out who Mostly Harmless was, but he didn't take into consideration that these are real people out there and he could possibly be hurting them. I feel his intentions were good, but I do understand his point. According to the HBO documentary, they called him Mostly Harmless. There was even a guy whose real name is Bill Bellamy, which is the same alias Mostly Harmless used to check into the hostel. He received so much harassment on his personal blog. People were convinced he was Mostly Harmless. He looks nothing like him, and he had to go to great lengths to convince others that he was alive and well and has nothing to do with this case. A high-tech forensic company named Othram is convinced they can figure out who Mostly Harmless is, kind of. They have the technology to be able to take his DNA and figure out where his roots are. They've helped solve lots of cold cases. I browsed their website for a while and found cases dating back to the 80s and some even to the 50s, where unidentified remains were found, and recently they were given the DNA from the remains and they could find out a lot about the individual and ultimately who they really are. The Collier County Sheriff's Department is anxious to send Mostly Harmless's DNA to Othram, but it's going to cost $5,000. So they need to raise the money for this. With all the national attention this case is getting, it shouldn't be an issue. Users of a large Facebook true crime group raised the $5,000 in less than a week. These folks have spent most of their free time just trying to figure out who Mostly Harmless is. They come home from their jobs and get to work being an amateur detective. A bone fragment from Mostly Harmless was sent to Othram, and it's going to take weeks, and everyone is holding their breaths waiting on what they will find. This is a kind, gentle man who had to be missed by lots of folks, and he deserves to have a name. According to reporter Olivia Waxman for Time magazine, in July 2020, finally the results are in. A live stream video played with thousands tuning in while Othram makes their announcement. They said the DNA analysis showed that he was of Cajun roots. Specifically, he was from southern Louisiana. So we learned Mostly Harmless was telling the truth when he had told hikers he was from Baton Rouge. The Wired reporter I mentioned earlier, Nicholas Thompson, who wrote the article about him that went viral, thought it would be a good idea to buy Facebook ads featuring Mostly Harmless's photo and story. He made it so that it would target Louisiana users, since this would be an area that he would be known from. And it worked. Nearly 2.5 years since the story broke that a deceased hiker was found, several people immediately reached out to the Collier County Sheriff's Department and said they know who this mysterious man is. One was a former roommate, and she knew all about the scar on his abdomen. Everyone has a version of him that they imagined him to be, myself included. You probably do as well at this point. For me, I pictured a sad man who was on a quest to find himself. Maybe he was tired of playing programming games and working in such a fast-paced technology field. Maybe he wanted to do something different, so he went back to nature. Maybe he was terminally ill and refused treatment and wanted to go out on his own terms. A writer for Adventure Journal named Jason Nark had a really interesting take. He wrote on his website, and I'll give you the shorthand version. In my own portrait, Mostly Harmless is a mystic who left the material world behind, a transcendentalist who shed smaller, inconsequential truths for a larger one. He reads the clouds, he looks at the stars, he watches the return of the seasons, the falling leaves of autumn, the perfumed breath of spring, listens to the moaning of the wind, pores upon a book, or discourses the freezing hours away, or melts down hours to minutes in pleasing thought, all this while he is taking up with other things, forgetting himself. I get the feeling that Jason is nervous of the disappointment he may feel. He's afraid that Mostly Harmless will come out to be a very boring person. And I say this because he wrote on his website, quote, He'll be from Milwaukee or Brooklyn, as he had told other hikers. He'll turn out to be the guy from IT who helped connect our laptops to the office printer. Police will release a name and say he was an only child with no parents left alive to report him missing. Perhaps we'll learn what he was seeking on the trail. Maybe then we'll know how he could have had such a profound impact on so many people without ever revealing his identity. This part makes me so sad. Everyone was adamant about getting his photo out there so his family, friends, and loved ones could locate him. People were all rooting for him. They were his voice. But it never dawned on most of us. Maybe there is a reason that no one is looking for him. In fact, his former roommate said, there is a reason no one is looking for him. A DNA test was conducted using his mother's DNA to confirm their findings. Mostly Harmless was identified as Vance John Rodriguez. He was born February 25, 1976, so when they found him, he was 42 years old. He truly was from Louisiana. He was born in Lafayette. The username from Screeps people thought was him was Vahor, which is a combination of his name, Vance John Rodriguez. It really was him. Photos of Vance's life before he became the unknown hiker named Mostly Harmless were widely circulated. He looked clean-cut, and every photo, to me at least, he appeared sad. He was telling the truth to one of the hikers when he said his dad abused him and hurt him deeply, although we don't know much more about that part. Vance has a twin sister and an older brother, but his family has nothing to do with him. Last they heard, he had moved to New York years ago, and they didn't know he was an unidentified body that was found weighing just 83 pounds in a tent on a Florida trail. Nicholas Thompson from Wired reached out to Vance's sister and family 2 weeks after the news broke that he was identified. The only response he received was, "My family has no comment." I can't speak for his family, but the vibe I get is that they don't care that he was found. They don't care that he was suddenly famous. Although I did read that once his body was returned to his family, they did give him a proper burial. Vance was 15 when he attempted suicide. He walked out into an open field and took a gun and shot himself in the stomach. He laid there bleeding out before deciding at that moment he wanted to live. He raised his arm to a passing truck, and the driver pulled over and got him to a hospital where he had surgery on his abdomen. That's where the scar came from. Then his parents had him institutionalized, which he told others he would never forgive them for. Vance was legally emancipated from his parents at the age of 17. Things must have been so bad that he felt the need that he had to do that, when in just 1 year he'd be 18 and a legal adult. At age 17, Vance is on his own. He graduated high school and attended the University of Louisiana. He became friends and roommates with a guy named Randall, and the two hung out and partied together, but he says Vance was always very quiet and always withdrawn. Randall said that Vance was a tech nerd who would just play computer games all the time, 18 hours a day. He hardly slept. He just played video games. He also said Vance would go through long periods of depression and wouldn't speak to anyone for months at a time. He wouldn't smile. He wouldn't even acknowledge you. His friends referred to these periods as outages. Someone would say, "What's wrong with Vance?" And they would say, "Oh, he's just having an outage. He'll come around." Randall said he was very moody a lot of the time and he always seemed annoyed, but Randall needed a roommate and the two seemed to get along okay. Vance just stayed to himself. According to Nicholas Thompson, Randall said that Vance certainly never showed any interest in the outdoors, saying that outside for him was between his apartment and his car, and that was it. He had no interest in going outside and certainly not hiking the Appalachian Trail. We learned Vance began working in Louisiana at an e-commerce company named Shopper's Choice. It's an online store. This explains why he told others on the trail he worked in IT. His coworkers said that he was the most talented employee on the team. The company's code base is still filled with his initials, VR, for the codes he wrote. A coworker said he tried to look for Vance in 2017 because he wanted him to build an app for one of his clients. This coworker said he would have paid any amount of money and he couldn't find Vance anywhere. Vance's friend Marie told Nicholas Thompson for Wired that, quote, He ate once a day, often pizza from Walmart or lasagna from Pasta Kitchen. He wore black jeans, a black shirt, and a black trench coat. He had long dark hair almost down to his waist. One day he cut it all off and gave it to Locks of Love. He attended Dragon Con. He appeared to suffer from some mental health issues, but he refused conventional medicine. He self-medicated with drinking and chocolate. He would go on what friends called outages, where he laid immobile for days, refusing food and all human contact. But eventually he would snap out of it. He wore his sadness like an extra layer of skin, but I truly dug his imperfectly perfect, solitary, singular self. Friends were shocked when they saw all these photos of him smiling while on the trail because they've never seen him smile before, ever. He looked happy, which was the opposite of who he was in his real life. And besides that, he's out on a trail. He looks like he's hiking and he's in good shape. This isn't the Vance they know, the guy who sits in front of his computer, 18 hours a day. Marie and his friend Randall were the only ones I could find that had any real good things to say about Vance. We learned that Vance had some even darker demons, ones that, once Vance is identified, cause people to say that he was a real piece of shit and who cares that he died. Yes, our beloved hiker that we were all rooting for. So the public finds out that Vance was in a relationship for 5 years with a woman who is unnamed for privacy. Once they broke up, she posted on Facebook. Keep in mind, this is before he ever went hiking, she posted this, so it's not someone trying to smear his name for attention now that the story is viral. She explained that she broke up with her boyfriend and she was living on her own now. She said she finally stood up to him for beating her up all the time for the last 5 years. After an article about Vance was posted, the woman's mother made a comment online that read, "This man was so abusive to my daughter, he changed her." Another woman had a relationship with Vance. She said they moved from Louisiana to New York City. This is why Vance told some he was from Louisiana, and sometimes he said he was from New York. She said they moved in together and got an apartment. He continued working for Shoppers Choice remotely. She said things were good in the beginning, but he would go through these outages and wouldn't speak to her for days. She said they rarely went anywhere, and when she would say things like, "Let's plan a vacation," he would say, "Why do I need to go anywhere? I can just look at pictures of places online." He often locked her out of the apartment when they argued, including once when she was completely naked. She had to stand outside in New York City naked, and he wouldn't open the door. This girl was injured in a terrorist attack in New York in September 2016. 3 bombs had exploded in the metropolitan area. The girl had PTSD and injuries, and she said Vance hated having to care for her. In fact, he kept a notebook where he documented every single time she requested any kind of assistance. She said his tech skills were scary because he threatened to dox her if she ever broke up with him. But eventually she did leave him. Within just a few months later, he was off to the woods. His landlord opened his apartment around 8 months later because he hadn't paid his rent in months. What he found was it appeared that someone left in a hurry many months ago. There was still food in the fridge. There were signs of life at one time, but things had collected dust. His cell phone, his laptop, his driver's license, his passport, and all of his credit cards, everything, all of his belongings were in the apartment. Nicholas Thompson noted in his article about Mostly Harmless, who we now know as Vance Rodriguez, saying, Vance spent the next 15 months hiking south and shedding all remnants of the man he'd been. According to friends who saw the photographs of him on the trail, he looked healthier than ever. He was smiling. Everyone seemed to like him. Had he become a different person? He asked this question to Vance's ex-girlfriend, and her response was that these people probably didn't know him well enough to see that side of him. He wasn't spending long periods of time with any of them. She also said, I think it just hurts that he was capable of being this person with complete strangers, but when it came to us, he couldn't even be a decent human being or treat me or my body with any dignity. A lot of people are upset at the way this all went down. It seemed like everyone saw him as this perfect angel, and then when it comes out that he wasn't one, now folks online are saying they're happy he starved to death. It reminds me of that episode of America's Next Top Model when Tyra Banks screams at that girl, How dare you? How could you? We were all rooting for you and you failed us. We were hoping he would be like Chris McCandless. Please look him up if you want. He was a 22-year-old hiker who died of starvation in 1992. He was found 30 miles away from the nearest town. According to Chris's sister, he trekked 2 years and into the Alaskan wilderness to cut ties with his parents and heal from his childhood. He graduated and donated everything he had to charity and set out on an adventure. He documented his time in his writings with his final words being, "Death looms, too weak to walk, I'm trapped in the wild. I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye and may God bless all." His story was made into a book and a movie called Into the Wild. I'm disappointed because I too wanted to believe that Mostly Harmless was a good guy who was just trailing along and that he cut ties with the modern world, or maybe he was terminally ill and wanted to go out on his own terms. That's what I wanted too, just like everyone else. I believe the women that say that they were abused by Vance, and I stand with them. I also believe Vance when he said he was severely abused by his father. I believe he was a tortured soul who projected that onto others. Some found it wrong and disrespectful that Vance's family was sent his belongings from the trip along with his money and other items when Vance made it clear to folks that he wanted nothing to do with his family. Why did he suddenly feel the need to leave his apartment and venture out into the woods? Was he trying to escape from himself? I've read so much about Vance over the last couple weeks, and they all seem to have the same ending, that he went from mostly harmful to mostly harmless. I don't believe it was a suicide. I believe he went into that tent one day. He had a very long outage that he's never snapped out of. It ultimately led to him starving to death. But we know he had a bowel movement in his body, so he had eaten something recently, but maybe it was just a bite or two. When you're 83 pounds, it doesn't take much to fill you up. As for the very popular HBO Max documentary They Called Him Mostly Harmless, it's trending right now in 2024. I watched it. It was cool to see the places and learn more from the hikers, but the dramatics between the women in the Facebook group showing how they didn't get along, I didn't care for, and I felt it took away from the story. This was a really sad story. He was not the hero we'd all hoped he'd be. I'm glad this case is solved, and I'm glad we have the technology to solve it. If this would have happened 30 years ago, we may never have known the identity and the backstory to the mystery hiker known as Mostly Harmless. That's it for this week, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all. Intro music is Feral Angel Waltz, which is composed by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons. All his music can be found on his website, incompetech.com.